Missouri, August 1828. A wooden cabin smolders in the night, its walls collapsing into flame. The cries of children have gone silent, 5 lives lost, 3 belonging to her master, 2 her own. Neighbors call it cruelty, a crime too dark to name. But for Annice, an enslaved woman with no future to offer her children, it was an act carved from despair. As dawn spread across Missouri, she stepped into history not as a victim, not as a heroine, but as a haunting truth. Even a mother's love can be broken by slavery. Annice's story begins not with choice, but with captivity. She entered the world already bound by an invisible rope, tied to a system that decided her worth before she could walk. The year and place of her birth remain uncertain, because records rarely preserve the details of enslaved women. Yet we know enough to imagine the silence that marked her first breath. She was born in Missouri, a frontier state still torn between wilderness and settlement, where cotton and cornfields spread like a green sea, cultivated by hands that would never own them. From the very beginning, Annice's life was defined by others. She was taught to labor before she learned to speak. Her earliest lullabies were the crack of whips and the sighs of women bent over fields, singing hymns half in prayer, half in mourning. Her cradle may have been a rough wooden box placed near the cabin hearth, but its shadow stretched into the fields of her future. A child in bondage inherited no family name that carried weight, no land, no legacy, only the certainty of toil. The cruelest truth was this: even her body did not belong to her. Enslaved women lived with the knowledge that their wombs were not their own. To give birth was not to extend one's family, but to extend another's property. This reality shaped Annice's girlhood like a storm on the horizon. She learned, even as a child, that laughter could turn to punishment, that innocence would not shield her. She grew in the quarters where stories were whispered at night, stories of Africa, of stolen ancestors, of resistance and despair. These tales, carried in hushed voices, were the only inheritance she received beyond her chains. And in those stories, one lesson stood out: the cycle repeats. The daughter of a slave becomes the mother of slaves, and each new life enters the world already sold in spirit, if not yet in flesh. Annice would one day become a mother herself, but the seeds of fear were sown early. To be born into chains meant never truly being born free at all. It meant stepping into a role written by men who never saw her as human. Her childhood was not marked by toys or learning, but by survival. Every bruise, every burden carried across a field taught her the same lesson: your life is not yours to shape. When she saw newborns swaddled beside cotton baskets, she must have understood even as a girl that the noi, the cradle, was only the beginning of the chain. The cradle by the field became the perfect symbol of her fate, soft beginnings placed on hard earth, a life that from the first breath belonged more to the master's ledger than to the mother's arms. When Annice first became a mother, joy came wrapped in terror. She cradled her child, but the warmth of that tiny body was haunted by a bitter truth. Her baby was not hers. By law, by custom, by the cruel arithmetic of slavery, her child belonged to the master. Every coup, every fragile breath was shadowed by the knowledge that the future had already been purchased. Other women in the quarters told her what to expect. They whispered of children taken away, traded like horses, or sent to toil before their bones were strong enough to bear the load. Some told of mothers beaten for clinging too tightly, for daring to believe they had rights over their own flesh. Annice listened, and her heart grew heavy with each story. Motherhood, in the world of bondage, was not a blessing. It was a wound that never healed. She learned to nurse her infant by night, knowing that by day the child might be called from her arms. She rocked her baby to sleep with songs that trembled between love and sorrow, soft hymns meant to soothe, but also to prepare for inevitable parting. Each time she heard her child cry, she felt both fierce love and unbearable dread. The cry of an infant should promise life, but to Annice it sounded like prophecy, a voice already marked by chains. She imagined her baby growing older, forced into the same fields, the same punishment, the same endless cycle. And in that imagination, she saw her own reflection trapped, exhausted, voiceless. Love made her fierce, but fear made her desperate. For Annice, motherhood was like tending a fragile plant in poisoned soil. You water it, you nurture it, you watch it stretch toward the light, yet you know the ground beneath is salted, and growth will never reach fullness. She saw her children as saplings on land that would never let them stand tall. The other women knew this too. They carried their infants while laboring in the fields, setting them down between rows of cotton, only to watch overseers calculate their babies as future profit. The very act of giving life was turned into economic gain for someone else. Annice's fear was silent, but constant. It crept into her thoughts as she cooked, as she sang, as she rocked her babies to sleep. It was a fear that whispered of inevitability, that gnawed at her soul. And yet she loved them fiercely, completely, with all the power of a mother's heart. That paradox consumed her, to love what she could not protect, to nurture what would one day be enslaved. It was this contradiction, repeated with each child's cry, that began to shape the impossible decision waiting in her future. The master's house was not only built from timber and stone, it was built from the lives of those who sustained it. Annice knew this each time she stepped through its doors, carrying trays, sweeping ashes, or bowing her head to orders. To her, the mansion was less a home and more a ledger, a living monument to arithmetic where human beings were measured not in worth, but in numbers. The master did not speak of her children as children, he spoke of them as increase. Each birth in the quarters was celebrated not with joy but with calculations, as though another calf had been added to the herd. Annice's womb became a site of profit. When she bore children, her master's fortune swelled. When her children grew, his labor force multiplied. There were no chains needed in such a system. The true fetter was economic logic. The overseers wrote the births in ledgers alongside bales of cotton and barrels of corn. A child's first cry was an entry, neat and orderly, in ink that ignored blood and tears. Annice noticed how the master's gaze lingered not on her, but on her children. It was as though her own existence mattered only as a vessel, a means of production. She had value not because she was human, but because she could reproduce. In that realization, her motherhood was twisted, corrupted into something unrecognizable. When she walked past the nursery reserved for the master's family, she saw cradles filled with silk and soft blankets. Her own child's cradle was a basket of rags placed on dirt floors. Yet in the master's eyes, the difference between those children was not just comfort, it was destiny. His children were heirs, hers were commodities. The cruelest truth came in the smallest moments. When Annice's baby laughed, she felt her heart swell. But when the master overheard, he remarked not on the joy of life but on the strength of lungs, the promise of future labor. Her child's humanity was invisible, only utility was seen. This was the silent violence of slavery. No whips, no visible wounds, just the reduction of human souls into inventory. The master's house stood as a shrine to that logic, its walls lined with ledgers more binding than any chain. Annice walked away from that house many times, but she carried it within her. Each visit reminded her of a truth she could not escape. Her children were not hers to keep. They were figures in someone else's fortune, pawns in someone else's legacy. And so, every step through the master's house deepened her fear. Each creak of the wooden floor, each tally in the ledger, whispered the same cold message: your children are not your own. The quarters were places of labor by day, but of whispers by night. After the fields grew quiet and the overseer's boots faded into the dark, the enslaved gathered around dim fires. It was in these hushed hours that truths too dangerous to speak by daylight were shared. Annice listened. She heard women whispering of lost babies, sold off at barely 5 years old. She heard men speak of running, only to be caught, whipped, and branded. She heard the despair woven into lullabies, sung low so that children might sleep without hearing the words beneath the melody. In these quarters, survival was bound to silence. Yet silence was never empty. It was filled with questions, prayers, and murmurs of rebellion. Someone once said aloud what everyone feared: there is no future for our children. The words hung like smoke, heavy and suffocating. For Annice, those whispers became unbearable echoes. She had lived the truth of them in her own arms. Each time her child stirred in sleep, she saw chains tightening around ankles not yet grown. Each time she heard laughter, she felt it already fading into exhaustion and grief. What began as fear slowly hardened into thought, and thought, whispered again and again, became something darker: resolve. She wondered if freedom could not be given, if the cycle could not be broken. Was death a crueler fate than life in bondage? Could ending suffering before it began be a twisted form of mercy? The whispers fed this thought, though no one spoke it directly. Some spoke of heaven as the only true escape. Some prayed that death would be gentle if it came too soon. Others admitted, in the softest tones, that they had wished their babies might not survive, spared from the life ahead. Annice absorbed these murmurs like embers catching in dry grass. They smoldered inside her, waiting for wind. She was not alone in her despair, but she felt uniquely bound to act. Her love for her children was fierce, and her fear for them was deeper still. The quarters taught her that silence could carry entire revolutions of thought, yet it also taught her that despair could be shared until it no longer felt like madness, but like clarity. In the stillness of those nights, Annice's heart became a battlefield. Love and fear wrestled endlessly, until the outlines of an impossible decision began to take shape. She did not yet act, but in the whispering darkness, the seed of her fate was planted. The night of the 22nd of August, 1828, arrived without omen. The Missouri summer air was thick, heavy with the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths. Yet in one cabin, Annice's breath came shallow, her mind circling the same thought that had haunted her for months. She had carried fear like a second heartbeat, but tonight fear shifted into action. Accounts would later call it murder, but in Annice's eyes, it was something else, an end to a cycle that had devoured generations. She could not pray her children free. She could not bargain with the master's ledgers. What remained to her was only the most terrible form of mercy. She waited until silence lay heavy over the quarters. The night insects hummed, a rhythm against which her resolve wavered. Inside the small wooden cabin, shadows stretched across the walls. Her children stirred in their sleep, their tiny breaths a lullaby that pierced her heart. In another corner, the master's children dozed, oblivious to the future being reshaped around them. No whip cracked, no overseer shouted. There was only Annice, a woman trembling but unbroken. She moved like someone carrying both death and deliverance in her hands. What she did cannot be described in detail, for the violence of it belongs to another register. What matters is the silence that followed, the cries that ceased, the air that thickened with smoke, the fire that began to consume wood and memory alike. Neighbors later said the flames rose high enough to light the fields. They spoke of timbers collapsing, of sparks leaping skyward like condemned souls. But none of them saw Annice as she stood within that burning silence, clutching herself as though trying to hold together a heart splitting in two. The act was sudden, but its roots stretched far into the past, into every cradle placed beside cotton rows, every ledger line that counted children as assets, every whispered fear in the quarters. The fire was not only the burning of wood, but the eruption of generations of despair. When the roof caved in and the cries had gone, Annice's figure stood frozen in the glow. In that moment, she was not villain nor martyr, but something harder to name, a mother whose love had collided with a world so cruel it made death appear as rescue. The fire would fade, the ashes would cool, but the silence it left behind would echo longer than any scream. Dawn came soft, gilding the Missouri fields in pale light, but the peace of morning could not disguise the devastation. Where a cabin had stood, there was now only blackened wood, smoke curling upward like the ghost of the night's deed. News spread quickly. By sunrise, neighbors gathered, eyes wide, hands covering mouths. The story passed from house to house, from white settlers to enslaved quarters. 5 children were gone, 3 of the master's and 2 of Annice's own. In a society that clung to order, this act was chaos incarnate. To the white community, it was monstrous. They called Annice heartless, a creature without maternal instinct, proof that slavery was necessary to control such dangerous souls. Her name became a warning spoken with disgust, her act reduced to savagery in their retellings. But in the quarters, the whispers carried a different tone. Some shook their heads in grief, unable to fathom the cost, yet others, under breath, spoke of her with a reverence too quiet to name aloud. She freed them, one murmured. She spared them what we could not. For those who understood the desperation of a mother with no path to protect her children, Annice's act was not madness but a terrible kind of mercy. Children peered through smoke-stained air, watching adults speak in hushed voices. They could not fully grasp what had happened, but they sensed its weight. It became a story older children carried forward, whispered around fires, a warning and a lament entwined. The master's family, enraged and humiliated, demanded swift retribution. What had been taken from them was not only children but pride, control, the illusion of untouchable power. Justice, as they defined it, would not be delayed. For Annice herself, there is little record of those hours. We do not know if she wept, if she prayed, if she stood silent as the ashes cooled. History does not record her words, only the judgments placed upon her. Yet one can imagine her sitting apart, her eyes hollow, her body trembling with both grief and grim certainty. The cycle had ended for her children, even if only through fire. By mid-morning, the event had already become more than tragedy. It was a rupture in memory. To some, it was a crime too great to forgive. To others, it was a desperate woman's last act of defiance against a system that left no other choice. And as the sun rose higher, the smoke thinned but did not vanish. It lingered in the air like an unspoken truth, marking the land and the people who bore witness. The morning after had dawned, but nothing in Missouri would look the same. The law came swiftly. Within days of the fire, Annice was seized, shackled, and brought before a court. There was no long investigation, no careful weighing of evidence. In Missouri, in 1828, the justice system did not exist for the enslaved. It existed to reinforce their bondage. The courthouse was crowded, not with advocates or sympathetic ears, but with neighbors hungry to watch a spectacle. Annice entered in chains, her body stooped, her face hollow. She was not allowed to speak for herself. No lawyer defended her. Her story, her fear, her anguish as a mother, none of it was invited into the record. The trial moved quickly, like a formality already concluded before it began. Witnesses recounted the blaze, the cries, the blackened ruin of the cabin. The master's family demanded retribution, their words laced with rage and grief. For them, Annice was less a woman than a warning proof that an enslaved person, left unchecked, was capable of unspeakable violence. The judge listened, but only to affirm what was already decided. When Annice stood before him, she was not a defendant. She was property accused of destroying property. Her children, even in death, were spoken of as assets lost. The master's ledger, once more, dictated the language of justice. Annice may have tried to explain, perhaps whispered words lost beneath the shuffle of boots and the murmurs of the crowd. But if she spoke, history did not preserve it. Silence became her companion, as it had so often in life. The jury was all white, drawn from the very community that demanded vengeance. Their deliberation took little time. The verdict was unanimous, guilty. The sentence was inevitable, death by hanging. When the gavel struck, it was not merely Annice who was condemned. It was the possibility of understanding, erased in favor of punishment. The court refused to see her as a mother driven to despair. It refused to ask what it meant for slavery to bend maternal love into something so unbearable. The trial lasted hours, but the outcome had been written long before. By the end of that day, Annice was no longer Annice in the eyes of Missouri. She was a cautionary tale, a criminal slave, her humanity buried beneath the word guilty. And yet, in the faces of those who watched from the shadows, the enslaved who dared to gather at the edges there, lingered another verdict, unspoken but alive. Annice had done what no law could explain. She had defied a system that allowed no defiance. The morning of the 23rd of August dawned with a chill. Though it was late summer, Annice was led from her cell, shackles clinking in the still air. The gallows had already been prepared, standing tall against the sky like a grim monument. Crowds gathered, drawn by curiosity as much as by vengeance. Men brought their sons, women whispered behind gloved hands. To them, it was a public event, a warning written in flesh and rope. Annice's steps were slow but steady. She wore no fine clothes, only the plain garments of a woman who had worked and suffered her whole life. Her eyes, some said, did not dart about in fear but remained fixed on the horizon, as though looking past the crowd, past the noose, toward something no one else could see. The sheriff read the sentence aloud, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly. Words like murder and crime rang out, but they fell hollow in the ears of those in the quarters who had come to watch from a distance. To them, Annice was not a monster, but a mother who had chosen an impossible path. When the rope was placed around her neck, the silence deepened. In that moment, history seemed to hold its breath. For the white community, it was justice served. For the enslaved, it was a mourning too dangerous to show. They bowed their heads, whispering her name softly, Annice, a fragile prayer carried on the wind. There are no records of her final words, if she spoke them at all. Perhaps she prayed, perhaps she cursed, perhaps she said nothing, holding her grief and her resolve inside until the end. What is certain is that her death was swift, her body left to hang as a warning. Children in the crowd looked on, some too young to understand, some old enough to carry the image into their dreams. Annice's figure on the gallows became more than punishment. It became a message, burned into collective memory. For the masters, it reaffirmed control. For the enslaved, it carved a wound into the soul, but also a memory they could not erase. In whispered voices, passed from one generation to another, the 23rd of August became not only the date of Annice's death, but the moment her story began to live. And so, in the hot Missouri air of that August morning, Annice was both silenced and remembered, erased in the records, yet alive in the murmurs of those who refused to forget. When the gallows were taken down and the crowd dispersed, Missouri moved on. For the authorities, the case was finished, neatly tied in a knot of punishment. Annice's name was written into the record in only a few dry lines. Annice, executed for the murder of 5 children. That was all. No mention of fear, no mention of desperation, no mention of the cruel weight of slavery pressing on a mother's heart. The official documents flattened her life into a crime. What she endured, what she carried, what she lost, none of that was preserved. To the world of white lawmakers, she had no story worth keeping. This was the second death of Annice, the erasure. In the years that followed, her name slipped from memory, repeated only in cautious whispers among those who had known her in the quarters. The master's family made certain the narrative stayed fixed. She was a savage. She was cruel. She killed her own. Their words were meant to bury her humanity forever. And in many ways, it worked. Annice's life faded into obscurity, locked away in county records that few would ever read. She became less than a person, more a rumor, a cautionary tale twisted to serve the needs of the system that destroyed her. Yet erasure is never perfect. History has cracks, and in those cracks, whispers survive. Enslaved mothers carried her memory quietly, like a warning passed to their daughters. Do not forget what this world can do to us. Do not forget how desperation can break even the strongest heart. Her name reappears only rarely in archives, but each time it does, it is like the faintest breath of a ghost. To the historian's eye, she is a footnote. To the enslaved who survived her world, she was more than that. She was the embodiment of the silence they all carried, the fear they all knew, the love they all risked. Erasure could strip away her voice, but it could not strip away the questions she left behind. Why must a mother see death as the only gift she can offer her children? What kind of system could make such a choice possible? Those questions linger, heavier than the rope that ended her life. And so Annice lives on, not in statues or honored names, but in the haunting gaps of the record, in the uncomfortable truth that history tried to bury. She remains, waiting for remembrance. Annice died on a summer morning in 1828, but her story has not finished. It reaches across time, asking us to see her not only as a criminal, but as a mother who faced an impossible choice. History calls it murder, but in her silence, we hear something else. Testimony against a system so cruel that it could twist love into despair. Her verdict remains in our hands. Will we remember her as a monster, or as proof of how slavery broke even the most sacred bond of all? If Annice's story moves you, subscribe to Murder Files Television. Some names nearly erased still deserve to be remembered.